So before we get to another Kingdom Hearts game, I want to be able to talk about an MMORPG game I synced a lot of hours into, Final Fantasy XIV. Final Fantasy XIV originally I never paid much attention to, but I did want to try out Final Fantasy XI when that was making the rounds. But with the lack of computer or hell the system to play it on, I was unable to experience it. Final Fantasy XIV was no different. I never heard or read about the game. I did not know if it existed until later in the years when it was called Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn. Hearing the stories about how the original Final Fantasy XIV does tie into the game today, but also was a sad disappointment upon release, is something to behold. There are a ton of videos that go into history of this game, both dying and being revived with a phoenix down, thanks to the man named Naoko Ishida. He managed to not only save Square Enix, but also managed to create one of the best MMORPGs to date. Final Fantasy XIV is something we're going to be talking about today. Hey there guys, my name is Kopika and today's video is going to be different. Today, we will be talking bits and pieces about 14, but also talk about why I love the game, and why I think you should give it a try, just a bit. Anyways, let's get started. So when I first got to starting Final Fantasy XIV, I did not know what to expect. An MMORPG subscription service was not foreign to me, since the only game I ever paid for was a game called Toontown. I have played my share of MMO games before, most of them are free, and I also mostly end up growing up with single player games. But knowing that my brother was enjoying it took me a bit to convince, since looking at it and playing it were not the same. I will admit, I did not find Final Fantasy XIV that great when I first saw it. I did not understand what was going on, what was happening, and what was the point of the game. Little did I know when I got into the world and tried that 14-day free trial, it was going to hook me in like a fish. Before you start your journey in Final Fantasy XIV, you have to go through the character creation system. God, this system was one of the stepping stones for me. Because A, since this was a character I was going to have to look at for the majority of the game, and B, they had to look so cool to me. I no longer have my first character, but let's just say they went for many different races. There are multiple races in Final Fantasy XIV, but the one that spoke to me more was the Lalafell. The concept of a small character being a force to be reckoned with was amusing to me. Little did I know we were mostly called potato beans and get made fun of. But hey, who cares? You piss us off? Well, you're gonna be tasting that sweet, sweet ground, if I'm a healer, of course. Not only was picking a race hard, but picking a class as well. I took interest in the Rogue class, but I was unable to pick it up from the start. This was because Rogue was added into the game during 2.0 and was only resided in Lemsa Lamensa. The only way to start in Lemsa, you had to choose either Marauder or Arcanist. You also had to be level 10 to be able to change into a Rogue. It was weird and something I wish they changed just a tiny bit. But once I was a Rogue, I was happy. Being able to do a little flip jump and wield 2 daggers, it was really fun. And since my brother showed me the wiki site of looking at ninja, I went for that too. But there was a catch. To be a ninja, you had to get 2 classes to a certain level, and also complete a certain quest. Rogue needed to be level 30, while Pugilist, for whatever reason, had to be level 15. This was something I was not a big fan of at the time, because the act of me leveling and learning a new class was weird, and it was like starting back from square one. But this was also a good thing for me to learn. Learning that I can be anything I want without the need of changing or making a new character. Most MMO games, you usually always have to do that, so whatever class you stuck with, you were stuck with that job or / class for the majority of your character creation. And then you had to change to a new character if you wanted to try something new. I'm glad that Final Fantasy XIV gave people this option, because it was a very huge stickler problem when it came to old MMORPGs. So at the time I worked on almost all the jobs that I wanted to use, but it was still a struggle since leveling for me was really annoying. Some of the game mechanics in Final Fantasy XIV were more so busy work, and I was a very rushy person even though I had all the time in the world. Once I got the ability to become a ninja, I'm not gonna lie to you, the first job quest, which was something you had to do for both jobs and classes, was difficult. Like I said, I didn't understand the gameplay. I also didn't understand nothing else of ninja at all, so I was a full-on noob. And that was fine, even though I knew I was playing with real people whenever I got into dungeons. And I felt I could get by on my own. That was something I slowly started to learn for myself. I should ask people how I do some things and all that, but I never listened to myself and focused on trying to figure things out on my own. It took a bit, but one place slapped me in the face and made me realize if I wanted to have fun and beat something, I would need to communicate. This is easier said than done, since some listen and some flat out say you're trash. Luckily for me, it did make me realize that melee DPS, which means damage per second, were not for me. Being up close and front was not really good for me, and also it didn't help with the seating position I was in. So I put down my daggers and I picked up a book. Say hello to Arcanus, a sort of beast master who controls a little pet that aids them in battle. Arcanus becomes a summoner and is able to harness the power of the summons in the game, otherwise known as primals. Summons in the next expansion are going to undergo a massive change and be able to be the summoner they were supposed to be. Don't get me wrong, I loved Summoner when I first picked it up, but after my time playing the game more and more, I started to slowly change into healer. There are 3 roles in Final Fantasy XIV when you go through dungeons: tanks, healers, and DPS. All 3 roles have an important task for them to do in a dungeon: raids and or big fights. Tanks, of course, hold all enemies down and make themselves to be the target of choice. Healers focus on healing the team and keeping them healthy whenever damage is taken. And DPS focus on beating their enemies down without stopping. In dungeons, you will always have 4 characters with you: 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS. In a raid of 8 people, you will have 2 tanks, 1 off and 1 main tank, and 2 healers, which will take whatever responsibility they have to take during the battle. And 4 DPS, which still focus on beating down the enemies while also avoiding AoEs, otherwise known as area of effect. Now, this is something that hooked me into the game a bit more. The battles did not have you click an enemy and auto attack while sometimes pressing the action button. No, you still had things to do, like picking up chains to locking up a dog, being sure to dodge AoEs, placing marks when needed to avoid constant damage. This was something I really enjoyed as a whole, because even while fighting something so mundane, you still had to do something and not just go AFK. I was really glad as time went on, I started to learn more and more about battles and the job I was using. At the DPS or tank, you had things called rotations, and what that meant was there are some action buttons you use in a sequence you will focus on, while also adding some other cooldowns into the mix. I truly thought Final Fantasy XIV was more so press action button, monster dies. But finding out once you attain better action skills that are not just add-ons but an extension to your job abilities was something that I was amazed about. Every time I leveled up to gain a new skill, I was always wondering, okay, how would this be used in my rotation? It was such a fun thing to always learn. My journey around Eorzea was fun as a new person. I had to deal with a lot of random FC invites, otherwise known as free companies, which wants you to join randomly half of the time. Don't get me wrong, I get what they were doing, but half the time you should know not everyone wants to join a random FC. For one, you never know what you're going to get yourself into, and if they're bored with you, they just might randomly just kick you out. Luckily for me, I was on one of my random journeys in Limsa and ran into one kind player who not only gave me some gear, but also made me consider joining her FC. Sadly, I don't have footage of my first visit to the FC, but Dragon Army is very welcoming and was a very weird experience once I joined them for the very first time. As times went on, I managed to finish the main story of A Realm Reborn. I wanted to know if there was other content to do. During the downtime of no main story progression, players would go out of their way to obtain better gear. You see, even if you reach max level, that does not determine your full stats. The weapons or gear you equip determine your stats. This is otherwise known as item level. You will always be upgrading your gear for upcoming battles, and the only way to obtain such things, you're going to be doing the 8-man or 24-man raids. 24-man raids are usually focused on 3-tier dungeons with very powerful bosses, while 8-man raids focus on 4-tier bosses, while also having a savage version with increased difficulty. At the time before Heavensward was a thing, the only 8-man raid tier you could do was called the Binding Coil of Bahamut. Unlike the other raids, you were not not really able to just casually do this. The binding coil of Bahamut was extremely difficult and was not easy to get through. You can still experience the difficulty by just queuing in synced, but if you wish to enjoy the story, you can always go unsynced. The difference between the two is that one allows you to sync down to the original level, which is level 50, while the latter allows you to be at max level. The raid made me realize I was not really good as a melee, and the battles with Binding Coil of Bahamut Turn 9 was by far the hardest fight I've ever done. This battle did not have just normal placement mechanics. You had to put down comics down, separate them from each other. You had to have 2 tanks at least 1 DPS to end up tanking the 3 golems and allow them to eat rocks or else they will explode if there are any left. But don't make them combine together or they will become a giant golem and start one-shotting everyone. And if you have the rocks next to each other, they explode too. And you also have death walls, which if you get knocked back into it, you'll die instantly. This fight was just extremely hard, and 15 tries or even more were had. But you know something? Being able to beat this super boss gave me the excitement once I managed to clear it. This was when I took a massive interest in learning so much about the gameplay of Final Fantasy XIV, but after all the battles and all the murders of monsters, you can end up having yourself a little downtime with some mining, botanists, or fishing. You have the ability to become a bit of a worker in Final Fantasy XIV world. Being able to craft when you become an alchemist, blacksmith, whatever. The player base and the crafting are the many reasons players are able to clear some content. They are the goats in the Final Fantasy world. But once you're able to craft your own items, you can sell them on the market board. It's a really nice thing to do because since some items are really hard to get, depending on what you're trying to make, making gear or food or whatever and sell it back for profit is pretty nice to end up making money. The amount of money you can make by crafting is pretty insane. But the content does not stop there. You can also visit the Final Fantasy XIV version of the Golden Saucer. If you love Final Fantasy VII and wonder how a real version would be, well, look no further. It's maybe not real life, but it's close. The Golden Saucer has not only a remix of the theme from Final Fantasy VII, but also sports so many minigames that players would always come here to wind down. They would add many more minigames into the Golden Saucer whenever they can, but they also added the card game from Final Fantasy VIII, Triple Triad, sporting the OG theme from 8 and being just as competitive as in Final Fantasy VIII. You can also have card fights with real players as well. There is also chocobo races just like in Final Fantasy VII. Man, thinking about it now, the Gold Saucer really is a nice place to visit, and I feel it's a nice break from all the crazy dungeons and raids you always are doing. My time with Final Fantasy XIV has been a very long one, being something that made me love the world of Final Fantasy, but also enjoying the many cast of characters I've met along my journey. Weird as it may sound, being able to make my very own character and be part of the story makes it a bigger deal for me. I'm not just playing as a protagonist, I am the protagonist of my own story. Oh, before I forget, I should mention how much I enjoyed the music in this game. Final Fantasy has always been really good in terms of OST, and with Final Fantasy XIV, it still has the same feeling. Masayoshi Soken, the man who makes the majority of the soundtrack to Final Fantasy XIV, managed to make this soundtrack not only memorable, but also something to listen to during my time away from the game. Final Fantasy XIV's OST is by far one of my favorite OSTs of all time. And it might be cheating since, well, it's a game that's gonna be going on for a long time, so we will mostly have so many more songs along the way. With the upcoming expansion, Endwalker, I think I've said enough about Final Fantasy XIV without really going too deep into the story. My reasoning without going into the story is, well, I kind of want players to end up experiencing themselves and just tell them how my first few experiences was when I first got into the game. I think I might end up returning back into this once everything else is settled and done, but I'm really not entirely sure. Final Fantasy XIV is one of those kind of games that people should experience for the first time just to see how it is. There are going to be a lot of videos that would try to convince you otherwise, but hey, if you want to give it a try, you still have the capabilities to, thanks to the fact that you can keep going all the way up until Heavensward at level 60. You don't have to even worry about it. It won't be able to limit you for the most part. It kind of does limit you just a tiny bit. But anyways, it's a massive love letter for those who grew up with the series and for those who had to experience the 1.0 main story ending. Final Fantasy XIV keeps growing with new players' experience and old players greeting new players with open arms. I don't fully know the community, but I can safely say you will be right at home if you ever decide to enter the world of Eorzea. I'm glad to experience this game, but to also be part of a journey that will never be forgotten. I've been Kopika, and I'll see you guys next time. I know this has been a short video, and I know I could have made it longer, but if I did, I probably will be here forever. Anyways, catch you guys later. See yas!